Hey, it's Mandy Moore.
Sterling K. Brown.
And Chris Sullivan from That Was Us.
Spring is finally here. And if you're like us, you're looking for little ways to bring new energy into your home, starting with your bed.
I love everything about Brooklinen. I love the variety of colors. I love the texture. I love the coolness up against my skin. I'm a man who runs hot. These sheets keep your boy cool, and I love them.
Brooklinen makes it so easy to refresh your space with layers that feel light, breathable, and so comfortable. Finding sheets you love can be tricky, but Brooklinen nails it every time.
Brooklinen offers so many different tones and textures, which is great, since new colors can make your bedroom feel fresh and inviting. Plus, their lightweight, airy fabrics are perfect for sun-kissed mornings and cozy nights.
And the best part? Brooklinen has everything you need, from soft sheets to the perfect throw blankets to style and layer your bed effortlessly.
It's no wonder they have over 100,000 five-star reviews. People love them. So if you're ready to refresh your space, now is the time.
Shop award winners and fan faves in-store and online at brooklinen.com. That's BROOKLINEN.com. Get 15% off your first order today.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Oklahoma Christian University political scientist Trey Orndorff.
It's so fun to be the other half today, Mike.
It is kind of nice to be at least somewhat in the passenger seat. You don't have to worry about organizing and structuring. You can just kind of pop off whenever you want. I
get to be Ken. I just get to sit here and tell you that the Supreme Court is corrupt and we're going to move forward, right?
There you go. I was waiting for that. Well, we do have a lot to talk about, and I am eager to get at it. And I think the place we should absolutely start is with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And who he is sort of depends on where you stand. Because if you're a MAGA fan, well, he's this kind of super predator guy, right? A member of this ultra-violent MS-13 gang who President Trump quite rightly had deported back to his home country of El Salvador, where he's in a maximum security prison, and that's where he belongs, by God. Now, if you're on the left, though, well, you're more likely to see him maybe as this sort of young Maryland father of three, illegally deported, being wrongfully held in this horrific overseas jail with a well-documented history of a lot of human rights abuses. So there's a lot of disagreement as to who this guy is, but what everyone at least initially agreed on was that his deportation was a mistake because it violates a 2019 order from a U.S. immigration judge that barred his deportation back to El Salvador because the judge concluded that returning him to El Salvador would place his life in danger. Now, this happened in the first Trump administration. And, oh, by the way, the administration didn't challenge the immigration court ruling. And the Trump Department of Homeland Security at that point granted him a work permit. So there was that agreement, but the spin has sort of changed in Trump world in the last few days. More recently, they've been saying that, well, MS-13 has been designated a terrorist organization by President Trump. So that means since Abrego Garcia is thought to be an MS-13 member, he's not actually entitled to the sort of withholding order that the immigration judge gave in 2019 that should have prevented his deportation to El Salvador. And complicating things this week, well, El Salvador's president met with President Trump at the White House, and he told reporters who asked him if he return Abrego Garcia, of course I'm not going to do it. The question is preposterous. And then when he asked if he planned on releasing him, and he hasn't been charged, by the way, with any violations of law in El Salvador or the U.S., El Salvador's president said, we're not very fond of releasing terrorists, at which point President Trump said of the assembled media folks there, they'd love to have a criminal released into our country. These are sick people. All right. Well, now, yeah, I know. I got to just take a minute, but so the U.S. District Judge presiding over the case, Paul Lazanis, said the administration appears to be basically doing nothing, ignoring her order to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return. She said, I've gotten nothing. No real response, no real legal justification for not answering. And now she's weighing whether to hold the administration in contempt for noncompliance. And by the way, we talked about last week, the Supreme Court partially affirmed Judge Zenas' order, saying that the removal of Abrego Garcia was illegal and that Zenas properly required the government to facilitate his release and to ensure his case is handled as it would have been had Abrego Garcia not been illegally deported. But the court then added, while it's proper for her to require that the government facilitate his release, her requirement that it also effectuate the release was unclear and could potentially exceed her authority. And Zenas quickly complied with that, issued a clarified directive ordering that the Trump administration take all available steps to facilitate, no mention of effectuate at this point, his return as soon as possible. And in this instance, what the administration is saying is that, well, it is facilitating as ordered, but hey, our hands are tied. El Salvador isn't willing to release Abrego Garcia, so there's nothing they can do. It's out of their hands. Or in the words of Secretary of State Rubio, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. So the court can't tell them how to handle their foreign policy, and they have no control over what goes on in a prison in El Salvador. Sure. Anyway, now after the Trump administration appealed Judge Zenas' revised ruling, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals just yesterday afternoon ruled against the administration with Judge Harvey Wilkinson, a Ronald Reagan appointee, authoring the unanimous opinion. Now, the Fourth Circuit was not buying the administration's claim that facilitating the return of Abrego Garcia meant only to remove domestic obstacles to his return. They wrote that under the administration's view, facilitation would, in their words, facilitate foreign detention more than it would domestic return, and that it would reduce the rule of law to lawlessness and tarnish the very values for which Americans of diverse views and persuasions have always stood. Judge Wilkinson also wrote that the claims made by the Trump administration should be shocking, not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear. Now, in response to the administration's claims that the lower court's ruling on bringing Abrego Garcia back is judicial interference with foreign policy, Wilkinson said, hey, deference is in fact due to the executive in foreign affairs, but if today the executive claims the right to deport without due process and in disregard of court orders, what assurance will there be that tomorrow that it will not deport American citizens, which, by the way, Trump has talked about, and then disclaim responsibility to bring them home? And what assurance shall there be that the executive will not train its broad discretionary powers upon its political enemies? Not that that would ever happen in the Trump administration. Now, that's me, obviously. But the threat, back to Wilkinson, the threat, even if not the actuality, would always be present, and the executive's obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed would lose its meaning. And Wilkinson also called for the respect that courts are supposed to give the executive to be mutual. He writes, too often today, this has not been the case, as calls for impeachment of judges for decisions the executive disfavors and exhortations to disregard court orders sadly illustrate. So that's a lot, Trey. What is your take on how the administration is handling this, as well as the response from the courts to this point?
Well, I mean, one thing that we got to be thoughtful about here, and you have a really wonderful summary of it, is that the administration is definitely taking a two-line approach. And so on the one hand, we have Stephen Miller, we have President Trump himself saying, hey, look, we won. Didn't we win that 9-0? Referring to that Supreme Court case that you outlined about facilitate. And as you were then putting there, as both Stephen Miller and Marco Rubio have said, look, sure, if El Salvador, out of the goodness of their hearts, decide that they're going to release him, sure, we won't stop a plane from bringing him back. But as soon as we bring him back, we'll put him in court and presumably deport him again, in the words of Stephen Miller. And so I think in that kind of public context, in that media relations context, we're having pretty big defiance of the Supreme Court. When you take a look at the filing of the Justice Department, if you take a look at what they are actually saying, it's a little bit less clear, that they are saying, well, it was erroneous, it was a mistake, this isn't what it was really supposed to be. But again, that's not what we're hearing when we see kind of the news channels occurring here. Again, well, of course, the evidence was overwhelming and clear that he is a terrorist, that he is in fact part of it, MI13, and so I think that's the kind of take that we're having. But this goes back, in my opinion, Mike, to one of the problems that this is something that I have hammered on both as a scholar on this show, is this idea of an unchecked unitary power president sounds really appealing when your side is in. But by having that, you have weakened the guardrails of democracy and made the executive far too powerful. And here we're getting, I think, a prime example of what happens when we pull those guardrails off. And the scholarship is pretty clear on this. In the United States, we're weird in the sense that we have been a long-standing democracy with a powerful executive. Generally, those things rip a democracy apart. I'm not talking about ours particularly, but just on a large-scale empirical basis, you are less likely to be a stable democracy when you have a powerful executive. And I think no one thought that was a possibility for the United States. And I think this is an example, a clear example of that. And you brought it up a second ago, too, I mean, kind of obliquely, but I think it's worth pointing out. To this juncture, we have now had one immigration lawyer, one non-immigration lawyer, non-immigration lawyer who is a doctor in Florida, two of which have now received deportation notices, presumably in error. But of course, this too was an error. So to say this is problematic might be one of the most deep understatements I've ever made.
Yeah. And I think, well, I certainly agree with you. But then again, you and I, of course, have deep and abiding commitment to the idea of due process. But I think a lot of Americans don't necessarily. When I try to get out of my political, center-left political junkie, sort of my whole life has been politics mindset, and try to put myself in a different sort of frame of mind, I can see a lot of Americans thinking, well, wait a second. So there's this guy who an immigration judge in 2019, it's like 6 years ago, said was probably a gang member, and he came to the country illegally. I think there are a lot of folks saying, so why is this guy still in the country? How has he been allowed to stay in this country? That seems messed up. And I'm not agreeing with that, but I think that is certainly an understandable, in some sense, reaction. And certainly, even more than that, I think that this is a fight that the Trump administration desperately wants to have. They're saying, Cory Booker, Chris Van Houten, go to El Salvador. Go ahead. You can be for MS-13 gang members. We'll be for Americans. I just think, anyway.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, put it in context. I think you're saying something really profound and important, which is that the idea of legal systems is on its very face. What it does is protect individuals who aren't just presumably guilty, but are in fact guilty in many important ways. And that does run afield of an American idea of like, well, look, who cares about that? And you're right, we're weird on that front for sure. And the reason that it's worth being weird, and this is the way I put it to my intro students, is I said, look, grandma's cookies are not what creates Supreme Court cases, right? It is terrible or sometimes strange, eccentric human beings who do bizarre stuff that generally create Supreme Court cases. And the problem then, and this is when you're right that you have to kind of teach. I think it's one of the really important aspects. It's one of the reasons that I think civics is such a key element of education, is to think carefully about, well, the reason we have that kind of due process for what you might consider the quote unquote outlier is because that's where it's important. Because if you don't have it there, then you don't have it. Because by the time it gets to the normal, it's too late. The system itself has fundamentally fallen apart. But you're absolutely right, Mike, in the sense that I don't think the average person sees it that way. They've watched cop shows and they go, oh, look, we have all these procedures so that we can't put away bad guys.
Yeah. And I think, though, the part of the problem, I think it's illustrated really well if you look back at, well, is this guy an even is he an MS-13 gang member? Well, back in 2019, the immigration judge thought he was, but the only evidence for that is he was wearing some Chicago Bulls gear, which was supposedly what MS-13 gang members did, and he was identified as one by a police gang unit officer who was later fired for misconduct in office. And I think it's also worth pointing out that this informant said that he was active, Abrego Garcia was active in New York State, where Abrego Garcia says he's never lived. So this is why we just don't let the government say, well, this guy's clearly a bad guy, we're going to send him or her out of the country, because, well, oftentimes things come out when the other side gets its say. And I think, again, Americans don't appreciate that. I think you're right. Popular culture certainly suggests that, oh my God, there are all these things that are just red tape and bureaucracy that make it harder for cops and the legal system to get rid of bad people. And that certainly is true. But I think what folks don't recognize is the power of the state is an enormous thing. It is a awe-inspiring.
You can't stand against it. You purposely cannot stand against the state's power in general as an individual.
Right. As I've said for years, I think that the American commitment to things like due process and democracy, these are processes. These are not what most Americans think about or care about. What they care about are outcomes that they want. And if you give them the outcome that they want, they honestly, a lot of them, for whatever reason, do not care so much how you got there, just that we get to the right place. And it takes sort of going to that next level to say, well, here's why it's a problem to get to the right place by the wrong means. And that's just too much for a lot of folks to sort of, I think, process in some way.
No, it's absolutely true. But, one of the things here that we haven't even thought about or touched on is the idea of, so for example, and you're right, Trump even suggested, well, maybe you guys could take some of our terrible people, take American citizens as explicitly there. And the other thing you want to think about carefully, and this is a hard one, it's a really hard one to think about, which is to say, even people who do terrible things doesn't mean that any terrible response to them either ought to be a legal or, in this case, potentially even a moral response that we ought to be accepting, right? So, for example, because people steal doesn't mean that they don't deserve to have justice served, but cutting their hand off is probably not justice, and that, right? And so I think that's the other element that in the wake of this is difficult, is there's a moral element here of, okay, even if we're going to punish people, sending them to a torture prison is a problem. So, yeah.
I mean, that to me, even if the Trump administration were right on the law, I still, in that position, would not be okay with sending somebody to a prison where I had a reasonable suspicion, more than a reasonable suspicion, that they would be treated in a way that I would find unacceptable, shocking to the conscience.
If it would be fundamentally more abhorrent than, say, what would be in a supermax prison in the United States, you'd have to say, pause, wait a second here. Right? I mean, it just seems a fundamental consideration.
And I think in some way, though, on this, Donald Trump actually ends up being his own worst enemy, as he so often is, because it's one thing for the administration to say, hey, listen, we're removing obstacles, we're trying to facilitate, but El Salvador, they're just being, what are we going to do? It's one thing to say that, but then when you juxtapose that with President Trump being incredibly chummy and friendly with El Salvador's president, saying, build more prisons like that. I want to send more people to you. All of a sudden, it makes it a lot harder with a straight face to argue that the administration is doing anything but actively encouraging El Salvador to not give this guy back.
But again, in this case, you're seeing that as a bug, and I'm seeing that as a feature. Again, I think the reason Stephen Miller, I think the reason Marco Rubio, I think the reason President Donald Trump himself is saying it this way is this is a battle that he has been setting up systematically with the courts moving forward. So in this case, I guess all I disagree with here is I don't think he's being his own worst enemy. I think he is doing precisely what he intends to do.
I see. Okay. Well, I don't know that I would agree that there's that much planning in it. I know there's this whole idea that Donald Trump is playing 87-dimensional, chess while the rest of us are just trying to figure out checkers. I think he just pops off and just says crap that sounds good to him at the moment. And everyone then scrambles to find a framework in which it's not basically insanity. And that can be pretty
that's absolutely true. I'm not trying to suggest he's playing the 37 chess. But what I do think, though, is that one way that he is systematically popping off is against courts. And I think he is, in these moments, frustrated systematically with courts. And so as a result, in other words, I don't think there's some deep plan to it other than I'm tired of the court stopping me from doing stuff. I'm not going to deal with it anymore.
Hey, it's Mandy Moore.
Sterling K. Brown.
And Chris Sullivan from That Was Us.
Spring is finally here. And if you're like us, you're looking for little ways to bring new energy into your home, starting with your bed.
I love everything about Brooklinen. I love the variety of colors. I love the texture. I love the coolness up against my skin. I'm a man who runs hot. These sheets keep your boy cool, and I love them.
Brooklinen makes it so easy to refresh your space with layers that feel light, breathable, and so comfortable. Finding sheets you love can be tricky, but Brooklinen nails it every time.
Brooklinen offers so many different tones and textures, which is great, since new colors can make your bedroom feel fresh and inviting. Plus, their lightweight, airy fabrics are perfect for sun-kissed mornings and cozy nights.
And the best part? Brooklinen has everything you need, from soft sheets to the perfect throw blankets to style and layer your bed effortlessly.
It's no wonder they have over 100,000 five-star reviews. People love them. So if you're ready to refresh your space, now is the time.
Shop award winners and fan faves in-store and online at brooklinen.com. That's BROOKLINEN.com. Get 15% off your first order today.
And this is what happens when you have somebody as president who's emotionally like a 6-year-old, right? What anything that thwarts my will is by definition evil and wrong. I mean, and no, I'm serious. That's when someone has almost zero emotional maturity and that level of hubris and is in that big of a bubble. This is the sort of thing that you get. And I would say this is certainly as close as we've seen to the Trump administration. I mean, they're still claiming that they are not defying the courts, but it's getting about as close.
Well, who's making the claims? The lawyers in court, not in public. In the public, they're saying, "Hey, we're defying."
Well, yeah, even then, I think there are certain administration folks who are saying that these judges are crooked and should be impeached. But I don't think I've seen any top administration, anyone speaking for the administration in any official capacity saying, we're just not going to do that. They're not ready to cross that bridge yet. And I don't think they are going to. I hope they're not going to cross that bridge. But certainly you find idiots on social media saying that, yeah, they should just defy these court orders. And certainly I don't think that's going to happen because I do not think that Donald Trump is a particularly courageous person, nor do I think the folks around him are all that courageous. And that's just something that they don't have the balls to do. And that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, that would be, again, I am sympathetic to the left's arguments because, again, I'm a not Trumper, right? I mean, that's not a big shock to anybody who listens to the show. But that would be a particularly huge Rubicon to cross to say, nope, absolutely done. But, that's, I guess, what makes this case particularly enemy is, man, you're walking right up to that line, right? when you claim in public that the Supreme Court ruled in your favor when it obviously has not ruled in your favor, you're not defying the court in the way you're suggesting there. I agree with you, but I don't know how you get you can't get a piece of tissue paper between that and defying the court. It's that close.
And they can certainly drag this out for quite a length of time. And I got to say, it would not shock me if in that period there, Abrego Garcia came across some misfortune or accident or something like that and ended up not being around, not being alive to be deported back to the United States. And I think that there are plenty of folks in the magosphere who would say, well, yeah, the guy got what he wanted. Because again, if you're innocent, if you're innocent, sure, you should have due process. But if you're guilty, well, then you don't need due process, which is just,
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, so how do you see this? I made it clear that I do not think in the end, the Trump administration, when push comes to shove, and push will come to shove on this before too much longer, I think that the Supreme Court is going to say something more definitive on this. And in the end, the Trump administration is going to have to, well, I don't think we'll challenge the Supreme Court. What do you think?
So I have thought about this carefully. I think the most likely outcome scenario is that this comes back to the Supreme Court in particular ways in which the government's arguments effectively is this is a unitary power of the court. And I think what we'll be telling is what the court attempts to do, because there's two basic possibilities. One is that even the conservative justices, many of whom are very sympathetic, not all of them, but many of them are sympathetic to that unitary theory of presidential power, say, but not to this extent. And he loses. And then in that case, I think he backs down. But I do think there's a non-zero chance that the court, in order to avoid the possibility of Trump defying them, writes an opinion that basically says, hey, in terms of this unitary power, you have, we are telling you that you will have to facilitate its return, but we recognize that is actually, in fact, your power. And so you should do it, but this court order doesn't exactly enforce you. I mean, it's not going to be written quite in that language, but that would be the outcome of it. So an order in name only, in the sense of to avoid the possibility so that there isn't a defiance of the court. And I could see that as being a possibility as well, too. Some kind of 5-4 split. Yeah,
because I don't see this so much as being the court trying to intervene in foreign policy. I see it as the court saying, hey, you directly contravened by your own admission, even whether it's a mistake or not, a lawful federal judge's order. No question about that, right? It was a mistake. They've said that in their own filings. And so therefore, you should at least take all reasonable. Sure, you can't force El Salvador to do that, but you can certainly formally request it. And the fact that you're joking around with their president talking about sending more, that is pretty good evidence just on the face of it. You are not engaged in good faith negotiations with El Salvador, making any sort of real attempt to get this guy back.
I guarantee and that's where I think you could end up having that 5-4, right? And then they could say, yeah, but there's nothing we can do because that's foreign policy, right? I mean, that would be the out.
Yeah, I think this is more 6-3 or even 7-2 on this. I think maybe you've been hanging around too much with Ken and your faith in the court has diminished.
No, I'm not saying it's the most likely scenario. Yeah, I'm just saying that I think it's a non-zero. I think it's because, again, if you're the court, what might sway you, and this isn't me like trying to say that it's an ideological bias. What I'm suggesting on this front, it would be an institutional defense. Because again, if you thought there was a relatively high likelihood that you have some kind of Andrew Jackson, Donald Trump moment where, he's going to say, you've made your decision, now go enforce it, that would be devastating to the institutional integrity of the court. So I can imagine members of the court, both left and right, potentially huddling and saying, hey, wait a second, we don't agree with this. Let's write an opinion that we don't agree with it, but we don't actually have any kind of real bottom line requirement to avoid that particular issue. So I want to be clear. I'm not trying to suggest this would be a ideological question. I think it would be an institutional defense position.
Yeah, I see that as a possibility. I agree. But I think it's more likely that a majority of the members of the court understand now that at some point that Donald Trump is going to push them until they push back. And if they don't push back in a real way, he's just going to keep on going on that. And so the option to just get out of his way and write rulings that essentially, in effect, allow the Trump administration to do what they want, I don't think that's going to happen for that reason, because push is going to come to shove here. The court's going to have to take a stand. And I think there are enough justices who care enough about the authority of the court and asserting that authority in the face of what seems to me to be blatant disregard. I think it's going to happen, and I think it's going to happen pretty soon.
But again, this is the case we're talking about right now, and I hear that. But when you take a look at the whole docket of cases coming forward, I can imagine that this is not the one that the court stakes its flag on because of the nature of where he is, as terrible as that is. And there's several others on the docket where I absolutely agree with you. I'm not saying it couldn't be this case too, but I can imagine if you've got 3 or 4 cases like this, which one do you decide, which 1, 2, 3, or all of them, you're going to say, hey, this is where we're going to put the line in the sand as the Supreme Court. You might not necessarily pick this one. Yeah, but I hope you're right.
I mean, because you can't do that with Donald Trump. You can't just pick your bed. You got to put lines everywhere in the sand. You got to put lines. You got to put tent traps and barriers and all kinds of stuff, because this guy will blow through everything. I mean, if you give him an inch, he'll take anyway. So, but yeah,
that's fair. That is fair.
Certainly more to come on this. But for now, why don't we move on to our next thing? And not surprisingly, Trey, it's another Donald Trump story.
What? Yeah. We're doing more than one Trump story? I can't even believe it.
I should have mentioned, I think I wanted to mention this, that last week, I believe, was the first week I can recall in a long time on the show that neither Jay nor I mentioned the name Elon Musk. And afterwards, I felt like somehow lighter. And I think at some point, surely there will be a week where we will not mention either Elon Musk or Donald Trump. And I will feel, I don't know, somehow strangely liberated. It's bound to happen at some point. I don't know if we'll be around for that long, but God, I hope so. Anyway.
Well, before we get to this next story, Mike, didn't you have something you need to say?
Oh, yeah, actually, I did. Thank you for that reminder. Before we do move on to that next segment, I want to tell folks about an organization I think is doing fantastic work in an important area. It's called Homes of Hope, and they develop housing, affordable housing for lower-income workers. They also provide workforce development training to men who are overcoming addictions. And over the years, they provided just hundreds of good, solid homes, as well as sort of economic mobility work and resources for the people that they house. They've graduated 335 men back into the workforce. They have a 94% success rate of maintained sobriety and employment. Really impressive work in my book. But they can't, of course, do all that good work without our help. And they're a 501c3 not-for-profit group, meaning that if you donate to them, it's fully tax deductible as a charitable contribution. So I hope that folks will consider checking them out and potentially investing in the work they do. And you can do that at homesofhope.org. And I'll also make sure to put that URL in the show notes. So give them a look, and thanks so much for checking it out.
Yeah, I hope people do that. So yeah, let's move on to our second story. And, this week, President Trump called for Harvard University to lose significant tax breaks after Harvard became the first U.S. university to reject his administration's demand. Now, what was the demand? What's going on? Well, in the letter, which is now publicly available, the Trump administration outlined a pretty comprehensive set of reforms it was demanding of Harvard. These included changing leadership to reduce power held by faculty and administrators who are, quote, more committed to activism than scholarship, end quote, and any, quote, decentralization that interferes with the possibility of all the reforms, end quote. The biggest items in this letter are merit-based admissions and hiring reforms, with explicit commentary on plagiarism and plagiarism policy. There must be scrutiny to all international students who are going to be admitted to ensure that there is no anti-Semitism. And finally, certain programs which have quote unquote egregious records will need to be reviewed by an external party and be under continual watch for a number of years. So when Harvard rejected the agreement in principle, it kind of had its own explanation of this rejection of these demands. Harvard president Alan Garber said the university would not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights under the First Amendment protecting free speech. In his words, quote, although some of the demands outlined by the government are aimed at combating anti-Semitism, the majority represent direct governmental regulation of the intellectual conditions at Harvard, end quote. In response, the Department of Education said it was freezing $2.2 billion in grants and $60 million in contracts effective immediately. Just this past Tuesday, Trump went on his favorite platform, Truth Social, and said, quote, perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as public entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired / supporting sicknesses, quotation mark. So as he would then go on and he says, quote, remember, tax-exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the all caps public interest, end quote. Late on Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that Trump wanted the university to apologize for what his administration says is continuing tolerance of anti-Semitism. In her words, quote, he, meaning Trump, wants to see Harvard apologize, and Harvard should apologize. Now, I think there is some larger arguments to be had here as well. First, a little bit of context. Support for higher education in the United States is at actually historic lows as of last year. The most recent survey data from Gallup shows that support for higher education, especially among Ivy League education, has dropped from 60% to 36% over the last 5 years, while people who had no support have increased from just 10% to 32%. And that educational drop is across all ideological backgrounds. This is not just a Republican thing, but it is the most pronounced among Republicans. And the biggest reason, again, across the board for that drop in polling is that politics is a part of higher education. 41% of respondents said in 2024 that it was the political agenda of higher education that makes it an issue. And so we've already been seeing this, Mike. We saw this with Columbia already. Columbia took a slightly different track and tried to, come to an agreement in principle. Harvard has said is no, probably in large part because of the depth of its pockets, make that a possibility. But in a similar way, I think, to our first story where we're talking about the ease, what people like or doesn't like, higher education, Ivy League education is not a popular thing right now. It's a pretty easy target. And it seems to be one that we're going to continue to see come under attack from the Trump administration. What are your thoughts on this, Mike?
Well, that letter that the federal government and the three agencies, I believe, was sent to Harvard on April 11th. I read that as well. And talk about just ludicrous. I mean, I was waiting for the thing. I wasn't waiting for something about, well, you need to change out the soap in the dispensers, too. I mean, it was just such insane, Mike, basically putting Harvard in a sort of federal receivership. I mean, and the idea that if you're any kind of a conservative, a real conservative, you're rolling over. I mean, if you're dead, you're rolling over in your grave. Hopefully you're not. But you know what I'm saying? It's wow. The ballsiness of that, how intensely un-American it is, right? To just be, well, you're saying stuff we don't agree with, and we're going to hammer you, using government power to squelch speech that the administration objects to. I mean, even the Wall Street Journal's editorial board said, hey, the government's got no business to pursuing all of these reforms. It's one thing to say, we think you might be violating people's civil rights. We're going to launch an investigation, and that's done all the time. You send out a letter saying, here's an investigation. There's this thing that the Trump administration doesn't seem to like so much called due process, where you get the answer. It goes back and forth. A determination is made, and then action is taken. But this administration just says, if you are against us, you are de facto, you are, as a matter of law, as far as we're concerned, in the wrong. So therefore, we can act without any sort of process any sort of judicial determination. And because, I am Donald Trump and I am the state, and I get to decide what is right and what is wrong. That to me is, the legal grounds are just not great for the administration here. The Supreme Court's held in the past that government can't use federal benefits or revocation of those to coerce parties to surrender constitutional rights. And many of these reforms clearly call on that. So it's not like, I don't think this is a winning case. I think this is much more a winning issue, if you will, as you alluded to. And it is going to be hard, even on Harvard. Certainly it has the biggest endowment of any U.S. university, but something like 70% or more of that is earmarked for certain specific things. So they can't necessarily just move around those funds and that sort of thing. And so I think Harvard's going to hang in there, and hopefully it will stiffen the spine of other institutions who don't cave like Columbia and some of these others have as well. But legally, I think this is a losing battle for the administration. But as you point out, with the perception of higher ed that's been driven so low, in part by Donald Trump and his compatriots, I think it's potentially a winning political issue.
Yeah, for sure. And two things on this front. One, I certainly, and I know you too, we are in agreement that there are things that higher education could absolutely do better than is happening right now. But this letter addresses absolutely none of those. As a matter of fact, has some contradictory portions we can talk about in a second. And the second item is, on the front of anti-Semitism, I have probably been of all of the hosts, I have probably been maybe the most vehement in defense of Israel, to the point that we've had some conversations about that, right? And that, this idea that this is all about anti-Semitism is just so blatantly not true that the most ardent person who's going to take a position can't help, if you actually read this, but go, what are you talking about? No. And one of the pieces of this is, for anybody, you probably don't have to read the details of all of these things, but the idea that, so for example, I quoted, well, you don't want to have any kind of decentralization because that's going to not facilitate this. Or we want to make sure that we empower tenured faculty, but not untenured faculty, unless, of course, the tenured faculty have too much power, in which case then they shouldn't have any because they might be, activists. Like, what does that even, who do you want to have in charge of this? That's just their first point, their governance and leadership reforms. Yeah. So, you're absolutely right on the merits. It doesn't even read the way you would anticipate this kind of legal document. It reads very much in the way that I would anticipate an undergraduate writing something and they're upset about it in student government. That's what this reads like.
Yeah, maybe they just ran it through GPT or something. I had that do it. I don't know. But and the IRS thing, we haven't even really gotten to that in a big way.
No.
But it is illegal for the president or top administration officials to directly or indirectly request that the formally or informally request that the IRS launch an audit or consider the tax-exempt status of an organization. Now, Donald Trump suggested that on Truth Social. Now, the claim is that the IRS was looking into this even before he did that. I think a lot of people are deeply suspicious. And to me, this goes to this almost completely invalidates a big part of the argument against Democrats and the Biden administration that folks like Jay were making up until very recently, saying, hey, listen, that.
Oh, you mean like Ted Cruz, who said that
yes,
if it had been a Republican and a Republican president in Congress who was threatening people's free speech rights via the IRS, that he'd get out there and he'd be the first person you'd hear?
Yes.
We're waiting for you, Ted.
Yes.
We're waiting.
Yes. The whole thing about weaponization of the Justice Department and weaponization of the IRS and all these things that conservatives were so worked up about when they claimed that Biden and before him Obama was doing it. Suddenly, Trump is doing this on not even pretending that it's anything but just brute force intimidation. And now all of these people who are either just quislings or cowards or some sort of, I don't know what. Politicians are generally awful human beings. I think there are some exceptions, but clearly they have no principles. Ted Cruz, we know, is a man without principles. To name one. But I think this really is a problem for the actual principled conservatives, people like Jay, who honestly believe that this weaponization of the government to go after political opponents was deeply wrong. Well, if it's deeply wrong when Joe Biden and Barack Obama, you claim, do it, there's no way, I don't think any reasonable person can say that Donald Trump isn't doing way more of this stuff in a much more blatant way. And just turning a blind eye to this is just rank hypocrisy.
Okay, I've got to ask the most important question I've ever asked you. What is a quisling?
A quisling, that goes back to World War II, the French who basically worked with the Nazis. And I think there was actually a guy whose name was Quisling, I believe. So, yeah, it's a historical thing. So if you're a quisling, it basically means you're a collaborator with the enemy, if you
okay. That makes, I mean, listen, from context, I recognized it was a bad thing, but I had to ask.
No, you don't want to be a quisling. No, generally.
Don't want to be a quisling. I'll have to use that. I like that.
That's a good one. There you go. So, yeah.
Well, no, but on your more substantive point, look, I agree. I mean, this kind of thing right here is why you don't want to have significant power in an executive branch, and B, it's the reason why party systems generally do not allow for there to be big pushbacks. Because look, Ted Cruz, maybe he did in fact mean what he said. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. But any political scientist worth his salt could have told him, like, no, you won't. Right? Because that's the nature. What government divides, parties bring together. And so the idea that you would be as vehement as he was with President Obama in that case, as he was with President Trump, is on its face ludicrous, because we know empirically how these systems work. And that just isn't the case. That's one of the things that makes presidential powers so particularly fraught, because it means effectively that it is only when you have the other party having significant power that you can check these kinds of items, or it gets thrown to the court. But in our system, the court really is not designed to be this kind of policy check. It's designed primarily to be, as we talked about earlier, that process check, and so it makes an awkward bedfellow at best.
Yeah, without it, I mean, of the things that the framers got wrong, and they got plenty of things wrong. They got plenty of things right. I would perhaps argue that the biggest thing they got wrong was this notion that institutional rivalries would be stronger than the ability of parties to kind of bring things together. And that I mean, they knew from pretty early on after that. It's like, nope, we missed on that one in a big way. And it's become more and more of a problem. And, too, I think until Donald Trump, really, we saw the kind of a lot of this being checked because there were these sort of unwritten rules, things you didn't do, challenges you didn't issue, places you didn't go, not because you maybe couldn't, but because no one had before. And it seemed like it was maybe pushing limits a little more than anyone was comfortable with. But Donald Trump clearly has no patience for any of that. And now we're realizing that all of a sudden, we're realizing, I think, the extent to which the stability of our system rests to a certain extent on the maturity of the actors in the system. And that's a scary thing, because now we're seeing some very immature, I'd say, actors in the system. And I think we're seeing the results of that.
No, I agree. I wish I could have some deep disagreement with you there.
But I guess I will say, I agree with Donald Trump that there is no entitlement to federal grants. And I have
absolutely
this is a due process question. I have no problem. I think there is an argument to be made that Harvard and other institutions are violating civil rights laws, are violating titles of the Civil Rights Act. I don't really buy those arguments, but I don't think they're unreasonable on their face. And so, hey, launch an investigation, give Harvard and these other schools their right to respond and present their case. And then if an investigation finds that they have in fact violated, okay, then go ahead and pull their funding if you think that's the right thing to do. But that hasn't been what they've done. And that, to me, more than anything else. And again, you're not going to win many votes saying due process, but there it is. It's incredibly important. All right. Any other thoughts on this before we move on?
No, I think we can move forward.
All right. Well, why don't we move from Harvard to Iran?
Very different institutions there, Mike, but that's fair. Well, yeah, this is probably in some ways the more thoughtful, weird thing that's been going on this week. It may be in a good way, at least in an intriguing way. I always like kind of doing some of the foreign policy stuff. So in some ways, it's funny, when I was thinking and prepping for this talk, it reminded me so much. I thought, are we back in the Obama era? We're talking about an Iran nuclear deal all over again. But, let's get to the brass tacks. The United Nations yesterday said that Tehran's nuclear program is at a very crucial stage. And while visiting the Islamic Republic of Iran this Thursday, as countless others have already pointed out, our tensions are very high with Iran currently as a result of the Israel-Hamas war and the issue of the Gaza Strip, with threats recently to use airstrikes to target Iranian programs. Although I do need to point out that this week it has been reported that there was a proposed joint strike that Israel brought forward that was actually ruled out by President Trump as he attempted to negotiate some of this. Right now, Iran and the U.S. have had one substantive talk, with another getting ready to take place. That would be tomorrow, Saturday. Depending on when you're listening to this, it might be in the past. The White House has said that the key element is to eliminate Iran's ability to enrich uranium. Now, that sentiment is echoed by Israel this week, but there is a difference. There is a pretty big difference there, in that Israel really wants to end all of the nuclear programs and just not the possibility of enrichment. So just be clear here. What we're talking about is, are we trying to get rid of any facilities, or are we just trying to slow down or prevent the ability of there to be nuclear weapons? And you'll sometimes, and this gets really confusing as you're reading about it in the news sometimes, if you haven't paid a lot of attention, sometimes called a Libya-style agreement, meaning that we're going to get rid of all nuclear production. Or is it, again, just more narrow in terms of weapons? And in terms of the technology, the distinctions there are significant, yet not always apparent and clear how you're going to do that. And so that requires a ton of questions of verification. How do you verify? In what ways could the host or the target country be evading those kinds of verifications? But it does appear like tomorrow that we're going to have more talks. It does appear that there are reasons that Iran actually wants to have a conversation with us and has some open and honest about that. I think this could actually be, as we kind of take a look at this, maybe the most likely foreign policy win for the Trump administration, especially in the wake of the fact that, I know we're all shocked that it appears that not much is going to be happening between Ukraine and Russia, according to Marco Rubio. What are your thoughts on this, Mike?
I love you calling it a win. To me, it's sort of calling this a potential win is like saying, hey, our team had the ball on the 1 yard line. We fumbled it, but then we recovered it. We stopped them on downs, and then we kicked a field goal, and this is a win for us. No, let's go back to some history here. 2015, Obama does the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, which limited Iran's nuclear program in exchange for significant sanctions relief. 3 years later, Donald Trump withdraws the U.S. from JCPOA, even though Iran was holding up its end of the deal based on multiple independent inspections because he believed it was, in his words, the worst deal ever. He says it a lot. But at that point, Iran's breakout time, that's the period you need to produce enough weapons-grade fuel for a nuclear bomb, was around a year. Today, a number of experts estimate that their breakout time is a matter of weeks. So in other words, Donald Trump took a situation in which Iran was a year away from having enough material to make a bomb, turned it into a situation in which Iran was weeks away from having enough material to make a bomb. And now he's saying, oh, maybe we should have some negotiations. Well, that's just friggin' brilliant. I mean, and by the way, Donald Trump has demonstrated that he is not to be trusted in any negotiations. I mean, okay, this was an Obama deal, and by definition, any deal that's not a Trump deal is a horrible deal, and he can do better. But he's shown he's even willing to break his own deals. Ask Mexico, ask Canada, when he just decided, that USMCA that I didn't break it. This is an emergency, because in the Trump administration, every friggin' thing is an emergency. So I can use those sweet, sweet emergency powers. So this is a situation that Donald Trump made go from bad to worse. Now he's trying to pull us out of it. And you're right, he might very well. And because Iran's concerned too, they know, I think just about a fact, that even if the U.S. is willing to kind of let this happen, I don't think we are. Certainly Israel isn't. And if there's credible intelligence that they actually are right on the doorstep, and you can't get much closer to this, there will be
how much closer could you be?
Yeah, there will be strikes. There will be military action, because Israel simply will not stand for this. And so now Trump's getting involved, saying, well, we can't have a Middle East war. I mean, God knows we're not doing really well in settling the war between Russia and Ukraine. This is the week, by the way, that who was it, with Vance or Rubio said, Rubio, if we can't get this settled another week, we're just going to have to move on, because, I mean, my God, we've been trying for a couple of months here and nothing's happened. That's like War and Peace reading type patience for this administration, which is just like the ADHD kids on frickin' crack. I mean, so, anyway. So, yeah, I see what you're saying.
I don't disagree with all of it, but let's be honest. I mean, you were talking earlier to me and you said, look, but what about from the public's position? Right. So you're talking about a position that President Obama had negotiated in 2015. That is a decade ago. And I love you, but I am not sure that decade-old agreement, as much as that is it'd be kind of like, if we're going to stretch your analogy to the breaking point, it'd be like watching a football game where there was one play a day, right? And it's going to take a year to get through the game. And yeah, you might look back and go, man, that was a really terrible decision in January, but now it's September. And that's, so
yeah,
I hear what you're saying there, but I don't think the average voter is going to look at all of that and go, wow, you really screwed it up the first time. I think what you're getting at it here is maybe an actual, like, okay, something has happened. Donald Trump said he can make something happen, and now finally something's happened. Now, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I'd hinted at it. I think it is even more crucially important, given that Russia is simply thumbing its nose at Donald Trump when it comes to any kind of agreement that it has made with Ukraine. And then that puts things in a really difficult position here, because you need something. But, your point on Israel, I would generally agree in which Israel is going to let that happen. But they probably don't. They don't have as much leeway as they did, given the conflicts that they are already fighting and the way that they are on the outside. It would be difficult for them at this juncture, I think, to make active strikes on Iran as much as they would want to.
I don't think so, because I think that what we've seen demonstrated over the course of a number of years now is that Israel's military capabilities are so far above those of basically all of their adversaries that they can, in fact, if they decide they want to take out Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, I'm fairly confident they can do that while dealing with everything else, because they know that Donald Trump's going to have their back on this. So I don't really see that. I think it will absolutely happen if push comes to shove in that sense. But again, I think more broadly, this illustrates the problem with being an untrustworthy person, a particularly untrustworthy person on the international stage, because this affects every single deal that Donald Trump does. Why should anyone believe anything that he says when it's very clear that the moment he thinks he can gain an iota of political advantage, he will pivot from whatever he said to something else, just claiming that, making up some sort of lie, because he's learned something very important about politics in the Trump era, and that is that lying really doesn't matter a whole lot. If you lie the problem is if you don't lie enough. What you got to do is lie big and lie often and double, triple, quadruple down on your lies to the point where your supporters are convinced you can't possibly be lying.
What are you talking about? You're talking about tariffs and deal making, Mike. Come on.
Yeah,
come on.
yeah. Everything.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
You come out there, you levy a 2,000% tariff. You say you're not going to change it, and then you change it 14 times. That is what made Trump University the success.
Yeah, there you go. Can't argue with that. No, that's true. He's going to do for the country what he did for Trump University. Yeah,
exactly. Just wait. I mean, that would be the ultimate. Listen. We can fix two stories with one problem right here. See, we bring back Trump University, we won't need Harvard.
There you go. I mean, yeah, really, we should just be investing essentially that $7-10 billion in Trump University, and you'd be. Yeah.
Well, and then when you would go, I bet you you could use some Trump meme coin. That'd be the way you pay, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You got it all figured out.
That's evil. I went too far. But anyway.
No, not at all. There's a senior advisor spot for you. I'm pretty sure. Just waiting. You might want to call there. Anyway. Oh yeah. So, but I don't know. I feel like I want to say that I don't think this is going to blow up into actual fighting, but I don't know. I mean, that's certainly my hope. But with this administration.
Well, look, the good news, at least, I mean, I think this one does have some good news in the sense that it does appear that Iran at this juncture, really, I mean, except for some of our poking at them, has been in a relatively negotiative, peaceful-ish, I want to, highlight the ish, a state compared with some of its historic militant behavior. And I think that does offer, I think that does offer a little bit of hope as we move forward, more so than maybe some of the other items. Ironically, in some ways, I think that Iran appears to be more willing to do deals than, say, Putin is at this, at any juncture.
Yeah, well, I think certainly because they are back. I mean, the sanctions have put a real hit on their economy. And so that's been an enormous deal. But that combined with the fact that they know there's going to be some sort of military action if they keep on going with an opponent who is far superior to them on the battlefield and with technology. Yeah. And I should point out, we didn't mention this, that Moscow has said that it would be willing to be a middleman in these negotiations. And so we certainly should do that because they are apparently our top ally at this point. It seems like,
I had not said that because I don't know. Yeah.
Well,
I do know.
I think just looking at all of this, it hasn't even been. It's hard to believe, Trey. It's not even been 90 days, has it? No, it's not even been 90 days, and yet I feel like things are just swirling apart or swirling down to what, and we'll get into this in the midweek show because we're about done here now, but. This, I feel like, is what happens when you have a system that's so based on executive power, along with an executive who decides to see exactly how much he can push out of that system. And it's not pretty.
Deeply agree.
And we will get much more of that on the midweek show. We're going to talk about that and a number of other things. We hope you will join us for that. If you are not a supporter, you will get that kind of 15-minute or so preview. If you're a supporter, you'll get the full thing without any ads or anything like that. So I hope you will consider supporting us. I always put the support links in the show notes. You can check that out as well. And of course, if you're not a supporter and you're not in the position to support the show financially, but you still want that full midweek show, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you are a supporter or not, it really does help if you rate, review us on whatever podcast app you're using, subscribe, as well as sharing episodes on social media. We really would appreciate that. And as always, before we go, I want to issue a thanks. I'm issuing a thanks, Trey. That sounds really weird. I've been a long.
You're going to give an executive order.
That's right. It is a Politics Guys presidential proclamation. Anyway, thanking our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Motz. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,